Okay. Active Directory, the main services. I am only going to cover domain services and some of the Active Directory fundamentals. I'm going to be looking at sysadmin type stuff, so the stuff that you'd need if you were setting it up or maybe exploring a domain. Fairly basic stuff. Think of this as introductions. I'm slightly rusty on this. I've put this together quite quickly as part of a challenge with Nikos, so it's going to be a bit choppy, but hopefully you'll come out of it at the end with a bit more of an understanding of Active Directory. So you've got an Ldap query at the top there. Mandatory, introduce the speaker slide. This is me. This is bringing back a lot of nostalgia from when I was a sysadmin and domain admin and had godlike power over thousands of users because it was in a school and schools were underfunded and I was the only IT person. But that's how an Active Directory entry looks, or an Ldap entry. Now, quick thing on questions. If you have questions, if something isn't clear, if you're interested in something and want me to dig into it a little more, just interrupt. Throw the question out, whether you're sticking it in tutoring no mic, and Nikos will then yell at me and tell me to answer it, or just call it out. This is not a lecture, it's not a talk, it's not a presentation. It's a tutoring session, so I really would like it to be interactive, particularly as my voice has been only just coming back after a week of COVID. So I could do with being able to pause and answer questions here and there. And I don't want it to be a one-way information dump. So if you've got a question, if I'm wrong about anything, which is entirely possible, or if you just want to know more about something, ask it. Any questions?
Not insofar as okay. I'm able to ascertain.
And if there's a question I don't know the answer to, because it's on more modern tech, I do actually have a brand new, barely touched domain controller sitting in the cloud that I'm logged into that we can break, explore, try out anything on, delete the schema, whatever you want to do. Starting off with the basics then. What is Active Directory? It is, the clue's in the name here, a directory of objects. It originally derived from the Ldap specification, or Ldap compatible specification, which is a subset of the X.500 telephone directory specification. So it's a very small segment of what used to be used to run telephone exchanges and email address books. And that is what even the most modern Microsoft networks fundamentally run on, because no one's found a better way yet. So let's build one. Let's build a domain. DC, by the way, stands for Domain Controller, not Data Center. Yes, it does get confusing at times, particularly when your DC is in a DC. And if you ask about the White House's domain, well, their DC is in a DC in DC. So we'll stick with domain services only for now. Active Directory does include various other services. So you've got Cert Services, which is a full enterprise key management system. We have Federation Services, which is a way of integrating your authentication with others and vice versa. Lightweight Directory Services is a cut-down version for application purposes that some applications used to use. I'm not sure if any still do. I've not seen one for years. And Rights Management Services is DRM stuff. So it's controlling flow of information within a company, and it provides DLP and all sorts of other aspects. Really fun stuff. The other part is, if you are dealing with domain services and Active Directory, you need DNS. It's not optional. You absolutely need DNS. Now, we are here creating the first domain controller, meaning we're creating the domain itself. If we were doing this in a real situation, we would be looking to create at least 2 domain controllers, and that would be for a fairly small network of maybe a few hundred people. If you're going bigger than that, you are going to have a lot more domain controllers. You will have multiple domains, multiple sites, possibly multiple forests if you're one of those companies that tends to buy others, all sorts of different things. We will get onto that, but we're sticking with simple for now. So we're building a domain controller. So you select domain services and DNS, and you select group policy management, because there is no point in installing Active Directory without using it to manage group policies. You might not be doing this on the domain controller, in which case you'd install that on the local machine, the admin machine instead, but we really want to dig into the group policies because they're the bit that does interesting stuff. Oh, and you do not want to be dealing with group policy through scripting or command line. Just don't. Go with the GUI. I hate to say it, but go with the GUI. Right, that's it. We're done. Yes? Well, no. So once we've done that, we need to decide whether we are adding a new domain controller to an existing domain. As I said, normally you would have at least 2 or more. Adding a new domain to an existing forest, we'll go into more detail about that. Or in this case, because it's the first one we're doing, adding a new forest. We also give it a root domain name, so digital.overdose.com. Great. And that's it. Any future domain controllers we add, we promote them instead. We just add them to the existing domain. They take all of their settings from there. Almost all of this gets skipped over. Forest functional levels. I'm not going to go into the granularities of compatibility between different versions. But Active Directory domains have particular functional levels depending on how legacy they are. So if we had a Windows Server 2003 sitting somewhere in the domain, I believe we'd be stuck on a maximum of Windows Server 2003 R2 domain functional level and forest functional level. The forest functional level cannot be higher than the lowest domain functional level in the forest. The domain functional level will depend on exactly which versions of Windows Server you've got sitting around. Go with the latest version if you're doing something new. If you're not doing something new, it will automatically be limited to match the domain. Doing a domain and a forest functional level upgrade still is, from what I gather, one of the most terrifying things a domain administrator can have to do, because it's then that things can go horribly, horribly wrong. A few other options. You can include DNS. Yes, you want to include DNS. Active Directory does wonderful things with DNS. So if your domain controllers are DNS servers, you have Active Directory integrated DNS zones, manages all of your domain name structure internally quite happily. Don't care about the public stuff, but when I gave it the domain name, I did do one thing which used to be seen as an absolute no, which was give it a .com extension. And the reason that was a no was because occasionally people would put an internal domain server or DNS server and make it publicly addressable. If your Active Directory integrated DNS has a .com extension or any official top-level domain as an ending, and it's internet accessible, someone can accidentally pull down your entire network list from your DNS server by querying your domain name. So it always used to be things like .local, .test, and various others. Nowadays, theoretically, boundary control is a lot higher. In practice, maybe, maybe not. And the reason this one particularly sticks in my head is when I was doing the course, the instructor pulled out an example that he'd used before of a company whose DNS was publicly addressable, at which point one of the people in the class said, "I've got to go and make a phone call." And shortly afterwards, it wasn't addressable anymore. Backwards compatibility. We are dealing with Microsoft here. Everything is backwards compatible, very backwards compatible. Now, you may have heard of NetBIOS and NetBIOS domain names. They have officially been deprecated and obsolete from roughly Windows Server 2000 onwards, which was fantastic. Except you still need a NetBIOS domain name to form a forest trust, because that's based on NetBIOS names, not on the actual domain name. We will get to that. All you need to know is it's deprecated, it's decommissioned, it's completely obsolete, but it's absolutely essential even in Windows Server 2019 domains. Right, getting towards the end of the config and installation now. This is about where we put the actual files, because it is a file-backed system. So we have the database folder itself. ntds.dit is the file that sits in there. The AD database was stress tested very early in its life, up to 16 terabytes of disk space with over 2 billion records. Now, I know that may not seem quite as impressive now, but back in 2003, that was pretty unheard of. This is the file that holds everything. Every domain controller has a full copy of this file, unless you've done various clever things around replication, and every domain controller will keep that in sync within the replication period. We then have the various transaction logs ready to be written into the database, and the transactions that we want to track being committed. We have temp storage for during maintenance of the domain. So if there are transactions that happen while we've got the domain controller decommissioned, we can continue to work on that and look at that, and we won't drop anything. The functional level is set by it's not even set by the lowest DC server version. It is set by the compatibility of the lowest DC server version, because I believe, for example, server 2008 R2 can support 2012 domain functional. There's a very confusing, headache-inducing matrix of what supports what and where. But it is the lowest DC server version, except if you have NT4 servers in your network. However, if you have NT4 servers in your network, go and find another job. Really, they're not going to be around long. Right, log files. Log files store logs. And let me get this controller back. There we go. Right, finally we have the Sysvol folder. And this is the big one. And for any of you out there who are on the more, let's say, ethical hatted side, you have probably come across this one. Sysvol is the replication folder for everything in the domain. So that will include login scripts, that includes group policy objects, that includes just about anything you care to name. At one point, it did include desktops, where you had desktops which followed users between computers. We don't really bother with that anymore, but you can. However, that's now stored separately because people started putting stuff on their desktop and they got large. If you can get malicious software into Sysvol, or if you can get any sort of control over it on a domain controller, so from a authoritative source, you can own the entire domain, and you can do it very quickly and very subtly. And yep, that's it. You then put a password in, kick it off, it restarts, and you now have domain controller. And your domain controller is one that theoretically you can never ever log into with a local admin account ever again, and the local admin account that was on it has just become the most important admin account you will ever see, and should be used immediately to create you another domain admin account and then disable itself, probably renaming itself as well. Any questions?
The ID of the first account always the same, or is it a well-known SID?
Sorry, what's that?
SID security identifier of the accounts. Is the first account of the you create, which is the administrator of the root domain, as it were, does that have a well-known security identifier, or is it a randomly generated one for that domain?
It is randomly generated for that domain. It's not one of the well-known ones.
Excellent. So renaming would actually, definitely hide.
Yeah, because it's the local account. There is nothing special about that account except that at that point it is the one and only account with any admin rights over your domain. So that is the key thing. Domains and trusts, and you can see the clever pun I went for here. Right. A single forest can contain many trees. This sounds like an obvious statement. When we're talking about domains, it can get a bit confusing. But let's go for a metaphorical forest. This is a forest. This forest contains 3 domain trees, one of which is digital.overdose.com with 2 subdomains, 2 child domains. One is dose.overdigital.com, and one is digitaloverdose.com with the child domain of events.digitaloverdose.com. Nice and simple. These all sit within the same forest, the same Active Directory forest. The first domain we created, that digital.overdose.com, is the root of the forest. That doesn't really give it anything special, except when we get to FSMO roles, that's the one where some of them will sit. By default, it doesn't have to be the case, but by default, all domains within a forest trust each other with a transitive two-way trust. That means that I can authenticate from any domain in this forest to any other domain in this forest and be granted permission to access resources there, and vice versa. And that is done not directly between the child domains. That is done by the child domain referring upwards to their parent domain. That's the transitive part of it. You do not have to set these trusts up individually, which is fantastic because it would be a real headache. And really all it means is objects in any of these domains can see what your authentication information is if you try to authenticate, and if you've got permissions, yes, you're in. Brilliant. Really nice and easy. Everything trusts everything, except it doesn't necessarily trust it, it's just allowed to trust it. Was that a question? Or just breathing? Right, breathing. Other types of trusts you can create. We have external trusts, which are to a domain in an external, clues in the name again, Active Directory forest. So this will be between 2 separate forests. They are always non-transitive. So they will always be between 2 specific domains in 2 separate forests. And only those 2 domains can talk to each other. And they can either be one-way or two-way. So I could have a domain that can authenticate into digitaloverdose.com without anything being able to authenticate back the other way. Or it can be two-way and we can authenticate to each other. Then there's realm trusts. Realm trusts are between Active Directory and any non-Microsoft Kerberos directory. So basically Unix, Linux, anything along those lines. Now, Technically, there's nothing to stop you from setting up a realm trust if you're trying to do an external trust, but why would you bother? Because they're a lot easier to set up as external trusts. They can be one or two-way, so you can have a one-way realm trust or a two-way realm trust. And they can be transitive or non-transitive. And they are an absolute headache to manage effectively. If you ever come across one that's working, it's probably been working for at least a decade, and you should never, ever touch it. Just a gentle suggestion there. Just walk away quietly.
But you should back it up, right?
Well, there's interesting problems with backups in Active Directory.
Okay.
Which we will get to. No, it's not never, ever, ever. It's more a case of unless you understand the realm that you are trusting and vice versa pretty thoroughly, don't touch. Because if they break bad. And if you are talking about something important enough to set up a realm trust, if you break it, you have probably broken authentication between two fairly large organizations, which have most likely merged, so you have just separated everything in the, I don't know, Oxford office from the Berlin office. Be very sure of what you're doing. This is a tread carefully area. Now, an external trust is between two forests, but between two specific domains in two forests. A forest trust is, shockingly enough, between two forests, but is transitive. So authentication by any domain in one forest to any domain in the other, potentially, depending on permissions and various other things. This is the one that happens when companies merge. This is why companies have horrendous domain structures that no one will ever get to the bottom of, because instead of sitting down and fixing it like good people, they just paste them together with full two-way trust between the two and carry on. There are good reasons for that. You are talking a significant effort to do a full rebuild or redesign, but it's still a bad idea to just paste them together with forest trusts other than as a temporary arrangement. But temporary arrangements have a tendency to become permanent. And the shortcut trust is, it's kind of a nothing. It's very rarely used, particularly nowadays. It was used more where you had very complicated domain structures in a forest with large numbers of child domains, and you simply want to take the shortcut between a child domain that, let's say, 5 levels down in one domain tree and another one 6 levels down in another domain tree without referring every single request all the way back up to the parent. So you just set up a shortcut trust between those two and they can take care of their own relationship without bothering mummy, daddy, granddaddy, and so on. Questions about trust?
Would the shortcut be to manage sort of traffic, as it were, in a very large organization, perhaps, where you don't want authentications running through a very complex set of servers, as it were?
So, I caught some of that. Do you want to repeat it before I just try and answer what might be the wrong question?
But when you thought about trust, is it generally to sort of reduce the traffic path, as it were, if you have a very complex organization?
Yeah.
So it's more performance based.
Yeah, exactly. It's purely for the user experience.
Cool.
I mean, it does have some drawbacks because those child domains are probably buried away somewhere with much lower security to access them, and you've just given them full trust to each other. So if one of them gets compromised, you're no longer referring up the tree to check against everything else. There are drawbacks to it, but it's faster. Right. Replication. Yes, it is kind of like Blade Runner, aside from being completely unlike it, but I told you, Active Directory jokes are really hard to pull off. Now, to throw everything off, we also have sites and services. So Active Directory sites and services is part of Active Directory domain services. Sites may or may not have any correlation with domains and subdomains and child domains in a forest. Sites are physical, and they govern replication and replication traffic. And they are defined by IP subnet or subnets. You can have multiple subnets in a site. You can have split subnets if you really, really want an excuse for overtime. You can do what BT do, or did back in the old days, and have a single site because you own the trunk and so bandwidth is meaningless to you. Or you can have multiple sites in different offices so that you're not spending a fortune sending Active Directory updates everywhere all the time. Now those updates within a site, the default replication time is every 15 seconds, which means that theoretically no domain controller should be more than 15 seconds out of date with the entire domain, no matter how large that site is. And that's largely true. Between sites, the default is every 3 hours. You can reduce that to 15 minutes, and you can increase it from 3 hours. But it just reduces the traffic. You're sending it in bursts rather than as continuous streams. Again, doesn't matter so much nowadays. Bandwidth is higher, but there are places where it does apply. And Maersk is an example where they were sort of very grateful for this. Sites use a store and forward mechanism. So if you're setting them up, you need to make sure that changes will cascade properly through them. So if I think replication will take, say, an hour between two sites, and I've got a third site that I want to tack on that is connected to the second one or is physically closer to the second one so the connection's better, that third site, I want its replication window to be after the second site. Because if I have it before, it's going to take longer for that replication to occur. Active Directory replication is incredibly resilient. I mean, genuinely, it is really, really effective. If you had all but one domain controller spontaneously explode in your network of hundreds of domain controllers, it might even be able to limp along on that one. Authentication would be slow, but it could probably just about do it with a good enough connection. But you could rebuild the whole thing in a few hours if you can get the DCs stood up in time. It is incredibly powerful and incredibly resilient, and if it's exploited, incredibly vulnerable. So no, it doesn't handle apocalypses better than BGP, and I am so glad you asked that. Bad stuff replicates too. I'm sure people here remember NotPetya and the Maersk story, where the whole company was down for days, had to switch over to WhatsApp. The estimate is every single domain controller within Maersk's 80,000 person company with hundreds of offices across the world, every single domain controller was unrecoverable within about an hour because of the replication. Not because they were all compromised by the same attack, but because that attack broke in, replicated with it, and bang, whole thing gone. Now, Active Directory isn't commonly backed up, particularly in large enterprises, because it's such a resilient structure. Actually, no one got fired for the Maersk one. I've spoken with the CISO a few times. No one got fired for it. They handled it extremely well. They were just extremely unlucky. Massive oversight, yes, but it was a very big example of what can go wrong. They took it on the chin, they dealt with it, and they fix things, restructuring the whole company, all sorts of stuff. If you ever get the chance to see one of his talks, go listen to it. He goes through the whole thing clinically and clearly. Anyway, AD isn't commonly backed up because it's so incredibly resilient. So your office blows up, great, you just replicate over a new domain controller. It's the rest of the stuff you care about. On top of that, restoring from earlier backups of AD can be hugely problematic. And we will get to that, I promise. But to do a TLDR, if you want to see me weep sometime, ask me about people doing authoritative restores of domain controllers that have been offline for 2 days and then aborting it when they realize what they're doing. You can break AD badly. So every single domain controller in Maersk, unrecoverable, no way to get all of their authentication information, all of their company structure, because it's the directory, it's not just people, it's computers, it's printers, it's everything connected to that domain. No way to get any of that back without a domain controller. They were very lucky because there was a domain controller sitting in Ghana, which had been knocked offline due to a power outage sometime before the attack, or before the attack took full effect. That domain controller held a full copy of the entire forest. That was the only one left. They had no other backup plan. And so they flew it out of Ghana, rebuilt the entire domain, and carried on. Not quickly, but they did it. So, replication, really powerful stuff, also has drawbacks. Problem with replication, how do you govern it? Active Directory is a multi-master database, so changes can be written to it from any domain controller within that domain. Meaning I could change your username sitting over in America, someone in the UK changes it, same time, a few seconds later, different name, whatever they do. Which change goes through? Well, each change is time-stamped, and the simple method is latest change wins. So if I update your username earlier, and then someone else does it later, when all of the conflicts get resolved, you get the later version. Nice and straightforward. That's the one that sticks. Really simple. Get your change in last, and it's the one that's written over the top of the others. This was, for a while, used as a way to undelete things in Active Directory, because you could stick a domain controller in a different site, not physically in a different site, you just stuck it on a different subnet, and you gave it a really long period of replication. And then you could sit there, and if you accidentally deleted something, you could run to that domain controller, and you could just edit that thing and edit it back before the deletion goes through. It was a really bad way of managing undeletion, but it worked. There was a better way even then, but it had drawbacks. Brilliant. Worst you'll get, few replication errors. You might see your username change a couple of times, or your background might change, whatever the setting is. Nothing really noticeable to users. Except that some things are just plain too important to rely on that conflict resolution. And for these we have the FSMO roles, which stands for Flexible Single Master Operation Roles. So you can see why we just reduced it to FSMO. There are 5 of these roles. 2 of them are per forest, 3 of them are per domain, and they control changes of particular things. So we have the schema. You probably all know, but the schema is the structure of the entire underlying database. It is sacrosanct. You can change it, you can edit it, you can fool around with it. But you can never, ever back out changes to the schema. Which is why you've got some weird legacy attributes in there. One of my favorites is the drink attribute, which is technically available to every user entry and is labeled as holding your favorite drink. There's also facsimile telephone number, which sits in there so that you can record your fax number in Active Directory, vitally important. And another favorite of mine, which speaks about the time that this specification was drawn up, is the secretary attribute, which stores the unique name of a person's secretary. So we've got some historical stuff in there because we can never back it out. You have this directory, which is incredibly powerful and carries all of the information of the company. Exchange attributes, everything, they extend the Active Directory schema. Some companies will have their own custom extensions to it. A lot of products which are enterprise-wide and interact with Active Directory, they will have extensions to it. The absolute last thing you want is changes to the schema conflicting. So the schema master is the one and only domain controller within a forest which is allowed to update the schema in any way, which means that any changes go there first, it approves them, done. In fact, the schema is so precious that there is no default way to edit it on Windows Server even now. You have to know a particular command which adds a snap-in to the management console, which will then allow you to edit it, and you also need an entirely separate permission from domain admin or enterprise admin or any other form of admin, which is schema admin, which by default only that first account ever has. Secondary domain admin accounts do not get it by default. They really want to protect this one. Another of the early commandments handed down was do not touch the schema unless you know exactly what you're doing. As far as I'm aware, and I suspect this is true, it does still apply. Having said all of that, if your schema master, if the domain controller holding the schema master role falls over at some point, you may never actually notice, because unless you're changing the schema regularly, and we're talking something that's done maybe every 3-4 years at most, you won't see that it's failed. You'll know that a domain controller has failed, but people often don't keep track of the FSMO roles as you would hope they would. Next, we have the domain naming master. As you'd expect, this is another of those forest-wide ones, because it controls the names of domains. Again, if it goes down, you might not notice until you try to set up a new domain or delete one or change the name of one, or create an external trust, because the domain naming master controls external trusts, because it controls the names. Then we go into the per domain ones. So we've got the RID master. The RID master produces relative IDs, RIDs, which are unique within the domain. And each domain within a forest gets a SID, a unique ID, which is a security ID, which is only unique to the domain. So every single object created within a particular domain gets a unique ID, which is made up of the security ID and the relative ID. So when Mark was asking earlier about well-known IDs, these are the well-known IDs. There are certain ones which are created by default within a domain. And if you can learn those, you can always find those accounts regardless of whether they've been renamed. The infrastructure master, I'll get to next. No one really cares that much about it. I hate to say that, but it's just not that important. What it does is it holds references to cross-domain objects. So it holds references to objects which are in a different domain. All well and good. Nowadays, with storage space being as cheap as it is, just turn on global catalog on every domain controller, and the infrastructure master becomes utterly irrelevant. One exception is that if not every domain controller is a global catalog, the infrastructure master should not be on a domain controller which is, because they conflict slightly if you're relying on it. Then we have the PDC, or PDC emulator. Now this is the Time Lord, the wrath of God upon failed logins, and the ruler of the changed password. Any account lockouts which occur because of failed attempts go to the PDC first. So it will send, this account has failed, this account has failed, this account has failed, and the PDC will go, great, that's 5 failures, you're locked out for 15 minutes. That's all controlled by that one machine. Authentication failures, password changes. If you change your password, it is not changed across the domain until it's gone through the PDC. Okay, fairly nice and simple, controls authentication to a degree. One other thing it does, which is also really important. The PDC is in charge of time. The Windows Time Service, which connects every single domain controller and pushes out time to them, the head of that entire hierarchy is the PDC. It is the time service that makes Kerberos workable. The first thing you will know about your PDC going down, aside from issues around authentication failures, is when suddenly you stop being able to access things because Kerberos breaks across the domain, because clocks have drifted out of sync by more than 5 minutes. Any questions about FSMOs? Cool, I'm being really clear. I'm going to take that away from it. Drink attribute, just in case you didn't believe me. Yes, it is real. Here's the definition of it. Still applies today. I checked on my own domain controller. You can get to it. Now,
Zero active directory or the new active directory.
what was that, sorry?
Do you know strings that exists in the new active directory? And yes, a zero active directory.
I do not know if they have different schemas. I couldn't find any real detail on a zero active directory. I would assume, given the way it works, that it is still the Active Directory schema underlying it, and it is still working on the same principles. It's just that a lot of the configuration is now done by cloud services instead. That's an assumption, though. And the real answer is I can almost guarantee that Azure Active Directory, if it's running on an Ldap scheme or Ldap compatible schema, which it is because you can search it with Ldap, will be identical plus a bit. They will not have removed anything because that would go against the specification. Right, Tombstoning. I mentioned about the weird thing of putting a domain controller in a different site so that you could undelete things that were accidentally deleted when your new network assistant accidentally deleted a parent organizational unit, which then destroyed the entire structure under it and wiped out all of the teacher accounts. These things happen, not that I'm speaking from painful experience. You can do that running to another domain controller if you happen to be in an organization which has the funding for that. This is all back in days of history. You could also simply remove the tombstones. Active Directory does not delete objects immediately. If you dealt with SharePoint or OneDrive or anything similar, you will be familiar with how this works, and it came from Active Directory, not vice versa. When you delete something, it's marked as deleted. By default, nowadays, you then have 180 days before it is physically deleted from the database. Used to be 60. One important thing, if you are upgrading a domain from 2008 or lower, change the tombstone lifetime to 180 because it will stay at 60. But yeah, you stick a tombstone on and leave it hidden away. Microsoft, for years, were very, very clear that there was no Active Directory recycle bin. So the only way to get these back would be to put your domain controller into recovery mode. In recovery mode, you would then do what's called an authoritative restore to the object, which would remove the isDeleted flag, and every single object in Active Directory has a version number. So it would remove the deleted flag, and it would add 10,000 to that version number. Then you would reboot that domain controller, put it back on the domain. Oh, look, there's a new version of this, and it's not deleted anymore. It was clunky and awkward, but it worked. And it was meant to be clunky and awkward and slightly hidden knowledge because Microsoft felt that deleting objects from the Active Directory was something that you should really take seriously. If you've gone into an organization and they've got something like a disabled user folder or disabled user OU, this is why. Nowadays, really depressing for some of us, you can actually just go in and click in a couple of places and turn on an Active Directory recycle bin, which means that this incredibly valuable piece of secret knowledge that you could turn into a sysadmin job no longer matters. Whew, any questions? But two-thirds of the way through. Tombstoning.
In general.
Yep. Is deleted is now referred to as tombstoning. It used to just be referred to as deleting or deleted objects, but now they're referred to as tombstoned objects.
Okay. I have a question for the end, but it's going to be an end question.
You can ask it now.
Okay. So a few months ago, we saw this massive thing going on where they were integrating Linux environments to Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
Has this made the entire environment more complex?
Yes.
By how much?
Lots.
Fair enough.
When you say you saw this massive thing, are you talking about a specific case or general?
Well, I was wondering, like, did it make it, did it then mean that Active Directory for us needed to support twice as many types of,
Oh, no. It didn't make it more complex for Active Directory. As far as Active Directory is concerned, they are just objects which are in a different forest, or rather another realm, and you authenticate to them this way. On the other side, yes, they've got to understand attributes and groups and permissions and various other things, but the complexity really is adding that many objects to your configuration rather than multiplying difficulties. So your Linux machine can now recognize Active Directory users, for example. So you could log on with an Active Directory security principal. If you've got the realm set up that way and they've got the permissions to do it, you would still need to manage all of those permissions on the Linux or the Unix side of things. Make sense? I'm going to assume the hamsters have given up again. Right.
Yep.
This was one that specifically came up. So Kerberos, golden tickets and the importance of timing. This is going to be a very, very quick skim through of Kerberos because it's getting late and it's complicated and there's a whole other session in Kerberos. But basics. Named after the three-headed dog, because engineers like to theme things and stretch metaphors, and the larger project it was developed within was called Athena. And because there are three actors in the protocol, which obviously means three heads. Engineers are bad at these things. We have the client, whether that is a user, whether it's some sort of service, it's some sort of user security principle. And it's seeking to prove its identity to a service on the other side, which could be a printer, a file share, fax machine, Linux machine, deity of the Greek underworld, whatever you want it to be. And we will call that the application server, which for some reason, God alone knows, is abbreviated to AP instead of AS or AppServe. Any of those might be sensible, but we have the client, we have the AP. Importantly, the application server and the client have absolutely no reason whatsoever to trust each other. Whatever the reason is, they don't get on particularly well, they don't trust each other, they both assume the other is lying. So, we introduce the Key Distribution Center, or KDC, finally an abbreviation that makes sense, which is a third party trusted by both the client and the AP. In Active Directory, every single domain controller is a KDC. So, Zagreus here, the one on the left, our client, asks for a ticket for its security principal. Remember, Zagreus is a machine, client's the user. Asks for a ticket for its security principal, which is the user, from the key distribution server, so KDC, and uses the security principal's password hash to encrypt the request and sticks a timestamp on it. With me so far? I'm going to take the brief silence as a yes. So Kerberos here takes the ticket, looks up the client in the database, because of course it's a security principal, it's somewhere in Active Directory, pulls out the password hash, uses that to decrypt the message. If it's successful, and the timestamp says it's fresh, then great. That fresh is within 5 minutes. This is why time is so important. So if it's within 5 minutes and it's successfully authenticated by decrypting using the password hash, the KDC gives the client, and I really hate this terminology, what's called a ticket granting ticket, or TGT. That's a ticket which allows it to be granted tickets. Yes, I know. Again, that's encrypted with the security principal's password hash, and along with that, the KDC sends a session key, which is referred to as a TGS. God knows why, ticket granting session. So sends that back as well. The TGS is then used for any further encryption. So far, we've had Zagreus there say, can I have a ticket, please? Here's my proof I'm me. And Kerberos there has said, yep, here's a ticket that you can use to get tickets. Kerberos recognizes Zagreus. Next, Zagreus presents his TGT, that ticket granting ticket, back to Kerberos, along with the distinguished name, the qualified name, the unique name of the service that he wants to access, and encrypts it not with his password hash, but with the ticket granting session key. This whole thing is referred to as a TGS request. Do not get that confused with the TGS session key, which is used to encrypt the TGS request. Kerberos is not actually this complicated, just the terminology makes it awful. Now we know why Zagreus is the god of madness. Anyway, Kerberos checks the ticket granting ticket. If it's successful, a TGS, which is different from the TGS that we had before, is generated, which contains information about Zagreus' security principal and is encrypted with the service's password hash. They are then both encrypted with the TGS session key and sent back to Zagreus. So at no point during this has Kerberos there spoken to Hades over there. No point within this has the KDC spoken to the target service, and it doesn't need to. Zagreus has his ticket, goes over to Hades, gives him the ticket, along with an authenticator message encrypted with the session key, and that's it. Hades recognizes that Kerberos says this is someone's trust and goes along with the request. So long as it's within 20 minutes by default. If it's in more than 20 minutes, Hades will instead go back to the primary authentication provider and say, is this guy for real? That's it. That's Kerberos. If your PDC has gone down, then computer timestamps will drift. You will start to see Kerberos authentication errors on average, within about a week. They will be intermittent and steadily increase. Any questions? Anyone need a drink?
Always.
Good. You may have heard of the Golden Ticket. Golden Ticket, built into Mimikatz years and years ago. It's a particular attack against Kerberos. It is not we're going to break in with this thing. It is more privilege escalation. So to carry it out, an attacker must first have local admin access on a domain controller. Now, you will note earlier I said local admins cannot log on to domain controllers. They can if they bypass certain security configurations, and they can be allowed to by specific things, which people who should never, ever be left in charge of the domain have a tendency to set up. Anyway, local admin access requires that, or some other way to capture the password hash, not the password, the hash of the key distribution service account. All that the attack does is then creates NTLM hashes, creates an ID in Active Directory, gives it an account username, one that you want to impersonate, and uses the password hash of the key distribution service account to grant themselves a ticket granting ticket, because obviously that's what you can do with that password hash. It proves that you're allowed to access that service. And they do that to get a ticket granting ticket with domain admin privileges. And a domain admin can access anything on the domain. That is, every single machine, every group, every resource. They can assign themselves permission. When I say that domain admins really need to be restricted, this is why. It's not simply that they can delete users. Nope, you're not confusing it. NTLM hashes, NTLM password hashes. Domain admins are all-powerful except for the enterprise admin, who is not only all-powerful over their domain, but every other domain in the forest. So, domain admin, don't let people get it. The other part of the golden ticket is that normally Kerberos tickets will have a lifespan, maximum lifespan of a few hours. Usually the default is an absolute maximum of 10 hours. Oh yeah, and Mimikatz is up there. By the way, you can set up a domain controller on Azure for free if you sign up for it, and then if you disable some security, you can pull down Mimikatz and have a play around with some of this stuff in your own little toy box. Anyway, the attacker can set the expiry time period, the lifespan of it, for up to 10 years. That's why it's called a golden ticket. Ultimately, it is a privilege escalation attack, and it is all built into Mimikatz. There's very clear instructions out there. Whew. Nearly there. Ldap. You will hear Ldap mentioned a lot in terms of Active Directory. They are not quite the same thing. Active Directory is a directory. It is a database. Ldap is a protocol with which that database is compatible, which is, as I said earlier, a subset of X500, which is a very comprehensive family of networking standards used to manage all sorts of electronic directory services. Ldap only has a handful of operations available in comparison. So we've got Start TLS, which opens a TLS session, makes it secure, makes it LDAP S, in theory secure, and sends a request to the server to start that session. Bind connects to a particular directory. Search, shockingly, searches a directory. Compare, compares entries. You can add, modify, or delete an entry in the database or in the directory. You can modify the distinguished name. That is a specific and separate item that you can do, or action you can do. You can abandon it, which is to say I'm going to cancel my last request. And you can unbind, which is a graceful closure. These operations can be sent to the server in any order, and the server will respond in whatever order it chooses to. So it's a asynchronous protocol. You send the request. At some point, you may or may not get a response to the request. The server does also have the option of sending notifications back without you requesting them, such as you're about to time out. Any questions? Great. Moving on. Can I get this done before past? Let's see. Directory structure. You saw my clever speaker introduction slide earlier. The directory structure is every single entry is nothing but a collection of attributes. All attributes have a name and one or more values and are defined in a schema. Each entry is uniquely identified by a distinguished name, a DN, which is its own name, its own common name, followed by its parent's distinguished name. If you think of file paths or almost anything else, this is the same thing, just completely flipped around. So, common name, OU, DC, DC. The OU is an organizational unit in Active Directory. They can be used to apply and scope group policy objects, which we'll get to. And they are literally what they say. They are to organize your directory structure. The DC is a domain component, and that's it. It's just part of that string of things. Whew, sorry, 1 second. Yeah.
You got this.
Yeah, just need a quick breather. Yeah, so that's a distinguished name. You will find much, much longer ones. If you have the distinguished name of an object, you can access it. When we get onto queries in a short while, it's important to note you cannot use wildcards on distinguished name attributes. They just do not work. Distinguished name attributes have to be perfect and literal. The rest of what you can see there is just a collection of attributes as defined in the schema, and no Active Directory does not actually have a Twitter attribute or a LinkedIn attribute. I did check. I'm sure that changes with Exchange, because I am actually convinced that the Exchange address book does have a LinkedIn link, and that address book itself is integrated into Active Directory. So one of the Exchange extensions, which I haven't managed to check yet, must be a LinkedIn attribute. Anyway, Ldap queries. Ldap queries are how you can query an Active Directory, also any other Ldap compatible database. They are straightforward but counterintuitive, slightly, purely because they work in a very different way to most modern query languages. We have your standard 3 logical operators, and, not, and, or. We have the wildcard option, which is your normal asterisk. And we have comparators. We can say exactly, equal or greater, or equal or lesser. We cannot say less than, we cannot say greater than. Also, equal or greater and equal or lesser do not work, shockingly enough, on string objects. Can't think why. Files are grouped by operators. So mostly nowadays, what you would do is something like the first one, where I've grouped 2 conditions together, and said, well, they're an and then or the second condition. So that would find anyone with given name James and surname Bohr, or anyone with the Twitter handle @Coffeefield. And I've just realized I forgot the underscore. Ignore that. That's someone else's account. Instead, what you do with Ldap queries is all of the logical operators come at the beginning of the group. So here we have an or, I've tried to color code the brackets so it hopefully makes sense. We have an OR, which works for either of the two, either the orange set of brackets or the green set of brackets. Then we have an AND, which works for the things within the orange set, so that's the equivalent. Does that make sense? Please say yes. I heard a yes. I'm going to call it a yes. Right, moving on from LDAP. LDAP queries, by the way, are incredibly powerful. If you ever get the chance to query a domain, play around with it, see what you can find. You can use them to do all sorts of reports because every single attribute can be searched on. So it can take about 30 seconds to find out everyone whose password has expired, as an example. Or it can take about the same length of time, depending on what the password policy setup is, to find everyone in the domain whose password is less than 8 characters long. If you want to ask about that later, feel free. Group policy. This is why domain admins have a grudge against Google Chrome, or why I do, because Google Chrome, when it first came out, they designed it deliberately to bypass group policy and software restrictions. Group policy involves a lot of settings, and I do mean an awful lot. Now, this is a slight lie. It's actually over 5,000 by default in a brand new Snow White, beautifully clean installation of Active Directory. But you can add admin templates. Only over 5,000, estimated back in 2008. So now probably more. You can add admin templates. So if you install Exchange within your domain, you're adding another few thousand for that. If you install the administrative template for Chrome, that's got a few hundred itself. So the number goes up really fast. What group policy really is modifications to the Windows registry. It's literally all it's doing. You can apply only, and I know this will disappoint some of you, 999 group policy objects to a user or computer before the system will give up and stop applying anymore. Do note that is group policy objects, not group policy settings. So each of those 999 objects have all 5,000 of these settings available. Group policy inheritance is fun, particularly when you're trying to debug it. Group policy object types. You have 3 types. You have local. These are the ones which are local. They sit on the computer directly. You have non-local. These are the ones which aren't local. They are stored in Active Directory. Old trick, still partly works if you do it right. In schools, disconnect the computer from the network, reboot the computer, log into the computer using your cached credentials, plug the computer back into the network. You now have only the local policies which are applied because the group policies never got downloaded. This has changed somewhat, but it was always fun in the old days. And is why you can push out local policies, but many people didn't. Starter GPOs, they are really boring. They're not nearly as exciting as they sound. They are just templates to create group policy objects from. So that's it. And as I said, what they're really doing is modifying the registry. So they're applying different things to the registry. You can do the same thing on your local computer by loading up regedit and seeing what's there, and you will see that all of your configuration settings are buried there. Now this is because I know there was a particular question about Microsoft and Active Directory compared to Linux earlier. Key difference, the biggest difference between Linux and Windows. Windows has a single authoritative central registry, which is called the registry. That is what group policy objects interact with. Linux has moved towards and away and back and forth on that, and it's all far too disorganized to decide to put everything in the same place. We can't even agree on what all of the partitions should be. So that's the key difference. Being able to control that registry is hugely powerful. What this all misses is what happens when two group policy objects conflict over settings. Fortunately, I have a diagram here to explain it. You can apply group policy objects locally. You can apply them to sites, you can apply them to domains, or you can apply them to organizational units. Active Directory, the last change, the last thing applied, is the one that takes effect. You cannot, technically, apply group policy objects to individual entries, but you can apply filtering to them, such as WMI filtering, which will limit them based on various local properties. So you can use WMI filters to deploy particular software, say, only to computers with a number of processors, or a particular processor type, or maybe a particular color theme set. WMI is surprisingly powerful. Or you can do it based on security groups, not address groups, not contact groups, security groups within Active Directory. Slightly confusingly, you apply a group policy or you exempt a security group by denying them read access to the policy. If they can't read it, it doesn't get applied. And you can do that again on a user or computer basis. When you apply multiple conflicting policies, they are processed depending on the scope of the application, so they are processed in this order. First of all, you process the ones applied to an organizational unit, then the ones applied to the domain as a whole, then the ones applied to the site, then you apply the local group policy. So the local group policy trumps everything else. If you've got multiple applied to the same organizational unit, which is the only place you can apply multiple group policies, then you have the option of putting them in a particular order and deciding how they're applied. Nice and simple. Organizational units can contain other organizational units. Group policy objects are inherited to child organizational units unless you turn on blocked inheritance as one of the properties of the organizational unit, which breaks that chain of inheritance. I would say never ever turn on blocked inheritance, and it's another one of those ones where it's almost always certainly true. But I guarantee you will not find a single domain out there which has been around for more than 6 months where someone hasn't decided it would be easier just to block inheritance here rather than really thinking through how their group policy objects apply. And 5 years down the line, that is going to be someone's weekend or maybe even several weekends spent trying to work out why on earth this new policy doesn't work for the CEO. Not speaking from experience, honest. Do not block inheritance. There's also the option of enforcement, because of course the later policy applied will normally take priority, but if you enforce a policy, it will prevent later policies from applying over the top of it. Again, try not to do this, except one exception. Your domain policy, possibly your site policy, should always be enforced because everything in the domain should pick that up. Now, it used to be your domain policy was where you set your password policy. And so you had one password policy for every single user object in the domain. Nowadays, it's slightly different. You can have multiple password policies, but still it is something you want to enforce as widely as possible. Whew. Right, that's it. There you go. 32 slides, Nikos. Did think about adding another 15. Just to get over the 46 target.
Slow clap.
Any questions? This has been a whistle-stop tour of Active Directory to give you some basics for it. It's not difficult. It's complex, but only because there's lots and lots of moving parts, not because they're particularly challenging. They are fairly straightforward.
A while back, you mentioned that for group policies, you have a preference for doing it through the GUI compared to scripting or
Yeah.
means. In regards to the stuff you were mentioning about LDAP, and I guess that would be completely different from group policies. Like,
Yeah, no, absolutely. LDAP, I think there are GUIs out there. I've never used one. I've always used to use VB script back when anyone used VB script. Now use PowerShell if I have to do anything with LDAP. You can use whatever you want. It's a standard protocol, so you could work with Java or similar. One important thing, one of the things that I did mention you can apply is startup scripts or logon scripts. Those must be batch files, VB script, or PowerShell. No other scripting language is accepted. But yeah, if you're messing around with LDAP text.
okay, and then in regards again to LDAP, I guess could you give an example of about when would you have to do PowerShell script that has to interact with that, and you actually have to like figure out what exactly.
If I am setting up, say, let's take an example from reality. If I am setting up 800 new user accounts and I've got about a day to do it because they only just gave me the new entrants, I can do an LDAP script to just import them all from a CSV and create them with whatever properties I want as standard. If I need to disable the ones who left because it's the end of school and it's their last year, I can do an LDAP script to do that. A PowerShell script to do that. So really it's bulk operations or poking around to learn things. Same with any scripting, it's when you want to automate it. I never want to do something twice. If I have to do it twice, I may as well write a script and have that do it for me.
Yes, the engineer's
Write a script to write the script.
Central registry in Windows, also the case where every high. Yeah, so they are, I agree, separate files, technically speaking, but they are all considered part of the registry. So it depends whether you say that a central thing must be a single file or just a known location with a known interface.
Okay, and then I guess going back to group policies. So one thing you mentioned was definitely password policies, making sure people try to have good passwords. What else would you, I guess, recommend as a best practice, or like something people should highly consider as adding as a group policy when, I guess, setting up their domain?
So for the domain policies, the best practices are fairly well established. You want as your domain policy the lowest password policy that you want across the company. The highest one you would apply in a different password policy because you can do that now. Didn't used to be able to. But you want lowest because, yes, it's slightly insecure, but you don't want everyone having to do a 16-character completely random password changed every 2 hours. Other things to apply, it depends on the organization, but removing interactive logon from certain types of machines, so from servers, you might want to do so that you can only remote onto them, you can do that. Creating local admin accounts on any domain user machines so that you can log onto those machines with a local admin account for troubleshooting. And fortunately, there's now a lovely password management tool that will give them unique passwords rather than a default one. Setting up the default permissions for users so that, for example, they can't install software or they can only install approved software, or so that you automatically install the software that they should get for them and don't allow them to access anything else. Setting up where users' settings areas are, so a file store somewhere where you can have them, and then any desktop they go to in the company, they get the same user experience. Doesn't matter so much now thanks to laptops, but used to be a big thing and does still exist in some places. Deciding which printers they can access, that might be important, but that's more likely to be a site policy. It's essentially anything that you want to apply on a company-wide level to your computer configuration. Giving them the same screensaver and background, that was always a popular one. Giving them the same startup noise was another popular one, or at least it was popular with admins, not so popular with users.
Out of curiosity, if you wanted to have the same screensaver, where do you put the file then?
So, you would put the file, there's options here. You could do a standard setup script which would trigger the first time a computer is logged onto, carries out what it carries out, and blah, blah, blah. You might do it as a standard deployment, or you could stick the file in the network share and refer to it there. So there's various options. Or you just use one of the standard Windows screensavers, because you know that'll be installed. The file itself you put essentially wherever you want to.
Okay, and then the group policy would tell it where to find the file.
Exactly. So the group policy defines where to find that screensaver, when to turn it on, whether to lock the computer or not when it turns on, all of those bits and pieces.
Makes sense. I guess if there's no I guess something just out of curiosity, I guess, what was the most, I guess, I guess maybe like, do you have any good stories about just finding a problem in Active Directory that required a simple fix but took forever to find?
Well, the examples of blocked inheritance, those weekends lost looking for it were not, they were from experience. In large domains, you can end up having to do that. There is a lovely tool called Resultant Set of Policy, which is all well and good, but when you've got about 600 policy objects applied, each of them with those 5,000 settings, and you're not sure which one you're actually trying to fix, it just takes time to go through them. As another example of something going catastrophically wrong, there was a school that I got called into where someone they'd had a problem with the domain controller, so they'd taken it offline for a while, worked on it a bit, stuck it back on the domain a few days later, and restored from backup and done an authoritative restore. Problem was, in the meantime, they'd had an induction of kids, so it was effectively going to wipe all of the kids' user accounts. Big problem, abort the restore, corrupted the domain. It took 6 months to recover it, because it was essentially going through and piecing it together by hand. It would have been quicker just to recreate it from scratch.
And it couldn't be recreated by scratch because somebody said we want it done this way, or
Yep.
is it just...
I was brought in as an outside helper to fix it. I didn't get to make the call. Hardening Active Directory. So hardening Active Directory is kind of, there is a whole other thing there. Mark's link to the best practices is a good one. There's a surprising amount you can do, but it does depend largely on your environment. For example, there's stuff you can do around whitelisting software with Active Directory, so you don't allow anything that's not approved to run in the first place. Or you can spend a fortune on an endpoint protection enterprise piece of kit to do the same thing. They're not quite equivalent. There are limits to the Active Directory one, but there are all sorts of options in there. There's a lot in those settings. Okay, in that case, I'm going to stop sharing, if I haven't already.
Yep. I'm going to also check that this is ending on our end, so kill the recording. And now let's kill Craig.
That's okay, Foley. Like I said, it was a particular challenge against Nikos there. Sadly, I think I lost because I was aiming for 47 slides.
Yes. Yeah, you're free to come back to do 47 slides. But the challenge is doing them in 27 minutes.
I was close.
I'm sure there was a 7 somewhere in there.
There was a 7 in there somewhere, yep.